Starmer's catastrophic poll collapse. Labour in fourth place. If you thought Labour's honeymoon period was rough, you need to subscribe right now, because what I'm about to tell you represents the most spectacular political collapse in modern British history, and it's only going to get worse from here. Keir Starmer is finished. Not metaphorically, not in some hyperbolic political sense. Actually, genuinely finished according to polling that should send seismic shockwaves through Westminster. A new survey by Findoutno has put Labour in fourth place. Fourth, behind Reform, behind the Conservatives, and in a statistical dead heat with the Green Party. Let me repeat that because it's so extraordinary it barely seems real. The governing party of the United Kingdom, less than 18 months into their term, trailing behind Reform, the Tories they demolished at the last election, and neck with the Greens. If you're searching for a single data point that captures the scale of Labour's catastrophic failure in government, this is it. The numbers are absolutely brutal. 32% of voters would back Reform if a general election was held today. 32%. Nigel Farage's party is not just competitive. It's not just challenging the established order. It's utterly dominant, commanding nearly a third of the electorate. The Conservatives sit in second place with 17%, which must simultaneously delight and horrify Kemi Badenoch's nervous MPs. Delighted because they are beating Labour, the party that handed them a worst defeat in living memory. Horrified because they are still 15 points behind Reform and facing potential electoral annihilation from a different direction. But here's where the poll becomes truly fascinating and devastating for Starmer. Labour and the Green Party are both on 15%. And when you examine the granular detail, the Greens edge ahead with 15.3%, whilst Labour sits at 15.2%. Now, before Labour's spin doctors start claiming this is within the margin of error, which it technically is at 2 to 3%, let's be crystal clear about what this represents. The governing party of the United Kingdom, with all the advantages of incumbency, all the resources of the state, all the patronage and power that comes with a massive parliamentary majority, is in a statistical tie with a party most people couldn't name the leader of until recently. That's not a margin of error problem. That's an existential crisis. Zach Polanski, the Green Party's new leader, must be absolutely delighted with these numbers. The Greens are performing at levels that would have seemed impossible just months ago, pulling support from exactly the demographic Labour thought was locked in left-wing voters, students, graduates, middle-class progressives who believed Labour represented their values. These aren't people who've switched to Reform over immigration concerns. These are people who've looked at Starmer's Labour, with its triangulation and calculation and endless compromising, and decided they'd rather back a party that actually stands for something, even if it has no realistic chance of power. And there's the double bind that's about to strangle Labour's electoral prospects. They are losing voters to Reform from their traditional industrial heartlands, the working-class communities that historically formed Labour's base but increasingly see Farage as speaking their language on immigration, sovereignty, and cultural concerns. Simultaneously, they are hemorrhaging support to the Greens from their newer coalition of urban, educated, socially liberal voters who think Labour's attempting to out-tough the Tories on immigration is morally bankrupt and politically stupid. Starmer is trying to fight a war on two fronts, and is losing both battles catastrophically. The strategic dilemma facing Labour is genuinely unsolvable with their current approach. Some of Starmer's colleagues feel, quite rightly, that is going too far in trying to win over potential Reform voters. His promises to crack down on immigration, his tough-on-crime rhetoric, his attempt to position Labour as a party of fiscal responsibility and controlled borders, these are alienating the liberal-minded voters who are more supportive of immigration and progressive social policies. But if Labour pivots back toward those voters, they accelerate their losses to Reform in exactly the constituencies they need to hold to maintain their majority. It's a political catch-22 of their own making. Findoutno's 3-week average data provides some context but precious little comfort for Labour. Over that period, they're in second place with 17%, Conservatives on 16%, and Greens on 14%. But here's a critical detail. Support for Labour has been falling since January, while support for the Green Party is rising. This isn't a momentary blip. This isn't one bad poll that can be dismissed as an outlier. This is a trend. Labour is losing voters whilst the Greens are gaining them, and that trajectory shows no sign of reversing under current conditions. Now, Labour's defenders will point out that Findoutno uses a slightly different polling methodology than most other companies. Fair enough. different methodologies can produce different results, and we won't know which polling company's methods are most accurate until we have actual election results to compare against. But even if you assume FinDoubtKnow's methodology skews slightly against Labour, even if you add a few points back for margin of error, even if you apply every charitable interpretation possible, Labour is still facing catastrophic numbers. At best, they are tied for second. At best, the governing party considering it a victory to be tied for second place is a damning indictment of how far and how fast they've fallen. Let's put this in historical context because the scale of this collapse is genuinely unprecedented. Labour won the last election with a massive majority. They were supposed to be in power for a decade. They promised stability, competence, and a break from conservative chaos. Instead, within 18 months, they managed to alienate their base, failed to deliver on signature policies, and position themselves as potentially the fourth most popular party in Britain. No modern government has squandered political capital this quickly or this completely. It's a masterclass in how not to govern. The Conservative Party's position in all this is grimly amusing. They should be delighted they are ahead of Labour after the electoral devastation they suffered. But they are still getting absolutely crushed by reform, trailing by 15 points to a party that didn't exist in its current form a few years ago. Kimi Badenoch is leading a party that's simultaneously celebrating small victories against Labour whilst facing existential questions about whether Conservatives have any future at all if reform continues consolidating the right-wing vote. The traditional two-party system has collapsed, and everyone's scrambling to understand what replaces it. What makes Labour's situation particularly dire is the absence of obvious solutions. Starmer can't simply pivot left to win back Green voters without accelerating losses to Reform. He can't tack right to compete with Reform without losing even more support to the Greens and potentially alienating moderate voters who backed Labour precisely because it wasn't Reform. He's politically paralyzed, trapped between competing constituencies with fundamentally incompatible demands. And every day he delays choosing a direction, both the Greens and Reform consolidate their support amongst voters who decided Labour no longer represents their interests. The immigration issue perfectly encapsulates Labour's impossible position. When Starmer promises crackdowns and tough measures, he's trying to speak to voters concerned about border security and cultural change. But those voters already have Reform, a party that speaks a language authentically rather than through gritted teeth and focus group phrases. Meanwhile, Labour's more liberal voters hear those promises and decide the party has abandoned its principles. They defect to the Greens, who at least have the courage of their convictions even if those convictions are minority positions. Labour ends up pleasing nobody whilst hemorrhaging support in opposite directions. The parliamentary arithmetic adds another layer of irony to Labour's crisis. They currently have a massive majority. They could govern effectively for years regardless of polling. But majorities are built on individual MPs who represent constituencies, and those MPs are reading these polls and calculating their own survival. A Labour MP sitting on a small majority in a reform-leaning constituency sees these numbers and panics. A Labour MP in an urban seat with lots of students and graduates sees Green support rising and worries. The parliamentary party isn't just concerned about the next election. They are concerned about their own jobs. And that creates internal pressures and divisions that make effective governance even harder. Starmer's personal ratings compound Labour's problems. He's managed a remarkable feat of making himself less popular than his party, which is genuinely difficult to achieve. Voters who might give Labour a chance despite reservations look at Starmer and see calculated ambiguity, triangulation without principle, and the charisma of a particularly earnest compliance officer. He represents everything people claim to hate about modern politics. Poll-tested, focus-grouped, saying whatever seems expedient rather than what he believes. Whether that's fair is irrelevant. It's the perception, and in politics, perception creates reality. The Green Party's rise under Polanski is particularly interesting because it represents something Labour desperately needs but can't provide: authenticity. Green voters aren't under any illusions that their party will form a government. They are backing the Greens because they agree with Green policies, trust that the party actually believes what it says, and want to support a political movement that prioritizes principle over pragmatism. It's everything Labour used to represent before Blair's electoral calculus became the party's entire operating system. And now those voters are leaving for a party that reminds them of what they thought they were supporting. The timing of this poll is particularly unfortunate for Labour because it comes as multiple policy failures become impossible to ignore. Record channel crossings despite promises to stop the boats. Economic growth stalling. Inflation forecast to be highest in the G7. Wealth tax proposals alienating business whilst raising questions about revenue projections. Protest law expansions drawing criticism from international human rights officials. Labour isn't just failing at one thing. They are failing at everything simultaneously whilst managing to alienate voters across the political spectrum. It's almost impressive in its comprehensive incompetence. What happens next is genuinely unpredictable, which is itself unusual in British politics. If these numbers hold or worsen, Labour MPs will start openly questioning Starmer's leadership. Not immediately, because removing a sitting Prime Minister is politically costly and practically difficult. But eventually, if the trend continues, self-preservation will overcome loyalty. MPs facing electoral annihilation don't sit quietly hoping things improve. They act. Whether they act effectively is another question, but pressure on Starmer will intensify if Labour continues languishing in third or fourth place while the Greens and Reform carve up their former coalition. The broader question is what this means for British politics. If the two-party system has genuinely collapsed into a multi-party scramble, traditional political strategies become obsolete. Electoral calculus changes completely when four parties are competing seriously for votes. Coalition governments become more likely. Single-issue parties gain disproportionate influence. Governance becomes more difficult because no party has a clear mandate or unified coalition. We might be watching the beginning of a fundamental realignment in British politics, with Labour as a first major casualty of forces they don't understand and can't control. Here's the bottom line. A governing party in fourth place or tied for third less than 18 months after a landslide victory is historically unprecedented. It suggests catastrophic failure in reading the electorate, delivering on promises, and maintaining any coherent political identity. Starmer promised stability and competence. His delivered chaos and drift. He promised to unite the country. His presiding over it political fragmentation. And now the polling shows voters have noticed and are abandoning Labour for alternatives that at least offer clear positions, even if those positions are polar opposites. This isn't hyperbole or partisan spin. These are published polling numbers showing the governing party of the United Kingdom potentially in fourth place. If that doesn't qualify as a political crisis, nothing does. And if you think this is as bad as it gets for Labour, you haven't been paying attention. Subscribe now, because when this story develops further and the knives come out in Westminster, you'll want to be here for the analysis. Starmer's completely finished, and we're going to cover every moment of his political collapse. See you in the next one.